Hi dudes and dames, and welcome. In this we'll take an overall rough look at the development recent years. Here comes a couple of clips, more from the presentation with Brigitte Gabriel, along with a couple of my additions. This would have been up sooner, but apparently statistics on no-go zones and hotspots aren't exactly growing on trees, but I have included what I could find.
Okay. Because by the time Israel came into Lebanon in 1982, we had 11 Islamic terrorist organizations operating out of Lebanon at that time. And this is how Israel came in, and that's how we came out of our bomb shelter and back to rebuilding our lives. I ended up moving to Israel in 1984 and becoming a news anchor for world news in the Middle East, covering world events and reporting on world events. And I worked as a news anchor from 1984 till 1989. And that's when we started seeing a rise of terrorist activities around the globe and terrorist attacks. And as I read the news night after night, I started realizing that there was a pattern developing. The name of the perpetrators, no matter where the terrorist activity took place, no matter on what continent, the name of the perpetrators were always Muslims. Ahmed, Muhammad, Hussein, Ali. The name of the victims were always Westerners, Christians and Jews. Terry Waite, Terry Anderson, Colonel Higgins, the Akili Lauro, the TWA flight, the Pan Am flight, and I can go on and on. As a matter of fact, in my first book, titled Because They Hate, I list pages upon pages of all the attacks that the Islamists perpetrated against the West and against America, where America hit the snooze button and went back to sleep. And I started realizing that what I used to think was a regional problem between a majority Muslim Middle East trying to either kill or expel the minority Christians and Jews had become a worldwide problem. But the world was not paying attention. The world was not connecting the dots. And isn't this exactly what the 9/11 Commission report said to us? We lacked imagination. It's not that we did not know that the terrorists want to attack the United States. It's not that we did not know that Al-Qaeda wants to attack the United States. After all, they attacked us the first time in 1993 with the bombings of the World Trade Center. They attacked the Kubar Towers in 1995. They attacked our embassies in Kenya and Tanzania in 1997. They attacked the USS Cole in 2000. And then they were so sure, so safe in our apathy, in our ignorance, in our lack of interest, that they came back and re-attacked the World Trade Center the second time in 2001. And this time brought the buildings down and killed almost 3,000 Americans. It's not that we did not know what they wanted to do to us. After all, we have never been faced with an enemy that tells us exactly why they hate us, how much they hate us, how they want to kill us, why they want to kill us. They not only tell us about it, they issue press releases about it, they write about it on the internet, they even record a video press release and mail it to Al Jazeera. They don't mail it by courier, to air worldwide, to tell us how much they hate us. And under all administrations since 2001, every single one of them buried their head in the sand, and none of them wanted to discuss the problem, nor the ideology, or what is driving them. And it all started with President Bush. I'm an equal opportunity offender here, because the national security issue is an American issue. It's not a Republican issue, it's not a Democratic issue. President Bush came out immediately saying, Islam is a religion of peace. Everybody, all our elected officials were bending backward and forward, tying themselves up like a pretzel, trying to run through the first red light to get to the nearest mosques to tell the Muslim, it's not your fault, you had nothing to do with this, Islam has nothing to do with it. Instead of calling the Muslim community on the carpet and saying, how can we have 19 hijackers that came out of your community from all over the United States, and none of you came forward and said anything. And don't tell me these 19 people just dropped from the sky. Nobody wanted to discuss the ideology. They told us it was Al-Qaeda's problem. Once we get rid of Al-Qaeda, everything's going to be fine. It's only Al-Qaeda. They ignored all other terrorists across the globe. Al-Qaeda was our problem. Well, now, when you look at it, now we have ISIS, obviously. And now when you look, now all you hear about on television is ISIS, ISIS, ISIS. When was last time you heard anything about Al-Qaeda? Unless Al-Qaeda said something to ISIS and then we report it. Like what happened this week. But everything now, the talk du jour is ISIS. That's our problem. But nobody is talking about the ideology that it's bonding all terrorists across the globe. When you look at what's bonding them all together, and you start looking at terrorist organizations across the globe, you started realizing whether it's Boko Haram in Nigeria, whether it's Al-Shabaab in Somalia, whether it's Ashkar al-Taibi in India, Ansar al-Sharia in Libya, ISIS in Iraq al-Sham, Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Al-Ikhwan al-Muslimun in Egypt, it doesn't matter what name they go by. What brings them all together is the ideology. Whether they are black, it transcends all color. I mean, these organizations don't even speak the same language. Boko Haram in Nigeria is black. They don't speak Arabic. Al-Shabaab in Somalia, Lashkar Taibi in India, they don't speak Arabic, they're Indians. When you start looking at this and you start thinking, how can our government and our leadership misrepresent the truth for us or lie to us for so long? But that's the reality we are dealing with, and it's about time we discuss the ideology and what is driving them. So, al-Baghdadi with a PhD in Islamic theology, and by the way was one of the most stellar students at the university. He was very well known in Iraq. But our President Obama knows better about the religion. They're nothing but a JV team and they are not Islamic. I swear to God, he knows it, that's the truth, and that he is convinced that's the truth, while the world laughs at us. So why should we be concerned about the Muslim Brotherhood? In the 30s and 40s and 50s, a lot of scholars in the in the Western world thought the Islamic State is over. The Islamic State will never be resurrected. Islam is finished. They don't have the resources. They don't have the power. They don't have the intellectual ability to invent things. I mean, after all, what have you seen come out of the Islamic world in the last 400 years? In areas of copyrighted great ideas or Nobel Prize winners or whatever. So a lot of scholars in the West thought Islam was over. But two things happened in the Middle East that gave the Islamists the money and the power to explode on the world stage. Oil. The discovery of oil, which we discovered in the 60s, and the Saudis were able to nationalize it. We were stupid enough to let them nationalize it. That gave them the money to spread their radical ideology worldwide. The Saudis have spent over $70 billion building mosques and Islamic madrasas worldwide. And the second thing that happened was Ayatollah Khomeini coming to power in 1979. That gave the Islamists the spiritual covering in order to move forward. So now they have the money, they have the blessing of the spiritual covering, and they exploded on the world stage. The Muslim Brotherhood wrote a plan in 1982, a 100-year plan for radical Islam to infiltrate and dominate the West and establish an Islamic government on earth. In the counter-terrorism circles, this plan became known as the Project. What makes the project so unique is it gives tactics and proposals as to how to infiltrate the West, how to use our laws against us, how to use our open-mindedness against us, how to use our multiculturalism against us. They talk about how to start non-profit organizations and human rights organizations and civil organizations and maintain the appearance of moderation in order to advance the radical Islamic agenda in the West. They talk about how to build community centers in the inner cities and use them as recruiting centers. They talk about how to get democratically elected Muslims on all levels in the West, including government, NGOs, etc. They talk about how to get Muslim interns in all governmental offices so they can have an insider view as to how policy is done on the highest levels. They talk about how to work with like-minded progressive organizations that share similar goals. For example, this is why when you see CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations, working with the ACLU, you scratch your head and you think to yourself, how can these two people work together? What do they have in common? But the ACLU is being used as the useful idiots at the hands of CARE, an organization with an agenda. They started implementing their plans in Europe. Remember, the plan started in 1982, in the 80s, in 90s, and 2000s, and now all the early 2000s. Here we are, 2016. Europe has morphed from Europe to Eurabia. Europe is no longer the place you used to go visit. And I visited there 2 years ago, before ISIS was what it is and before the crisis now of the immigration. 2 years ago, I was on a cruise ship in Marseille, and they told us specific instructions. You can get out of the port, and you can only walk these 2 blocks. Do not get out of there. It's very dangerous. The Islamists are there, and there is murder, there is rape. If you cross over those blocks, we do not guarantee your safety. They told us not to take any money with us except for credit cards that we can use only on that strip on Marseille, and that's it. I couldn't believe my eyes. I had actually an imam terrorist in the cabin next to me who didn't know I was in the cabin, and I'm sitting reading my book on the balcony, and they were sitting plotting next to me how they're going to bomb Spain. So of course I go down to the security, who happen to be all Israelis, by the way, in case you do not know, all security on cruise ships are Israelis, and I happen to speak Hebrew. And I told them I was just sitting next, and next to my cabin there is this terrorist who happens to be a doctor from Egypt, who was next to me. That's a whole other story. Do not let me digress. But this is how Europe is gone. Right now, as I'm speaking to you, there are 85 Sharia courts operating in Britain right now, parallel to British courts. Right now. In France alone, they have 725 no-go zones. 725. This is the little dirty secret that nobody wants to talk about. And you wonder what France is all of a sudden shocked. Why do they have such an Islamic problem, and how can they pull such terrorist attacks? That's why. But what we are seeing in Europe right now is a preview as to what's coming to the United States. Because they are moving forward with their plan much faster than what we had anticipated. Because remember, they wrote a 100-year plan for radical Islam to infiltrate and dominate the West and establish an Islamic government on earth. They already established an Islamic government. They didn't need to wait 100 years. They established it within 30 years after writing the plan. Europe is already infiltrated and almost dominated. Gone. Europe is 1 minute to midnight. Europe is dying.
Next, I'll take a look at the real condition of an impact on Europe, and later the actual actions, especially the continuously blatant dishonest foreign policy of the Western governments, which created the situation. Thanks for watching.